Okay, we can start. Good morning, everyone. Hello. Nice to see you after our in-person wonderful meeting in Barcelona. Back to have online meeting again, but it's really a pleasure to start this capacity building appointment. Once again, we are lucky to have our advisory board members and to spend some hours together with them and to listen to them, especially presenting their experience in their fields. That, of course, the reason why we have kindly asked to support us throughout the course of our project. Simon Burall is the expert of today, is very precious in our activity in Lombardy, as you know, even if we didn't have the time to have contacts or exchanges with him, like in the last part of our process. Anytime we have some doubts about how to conduct participatory process, what we do is to consult involved website. It's our sort of Bible for our activities. So, or there is the moment in which, okay, wait, I remember that Simon told us during that project, that meeting, or in Barcelona, he suggested us to do this way. And so we have to do as Simon suggests. So it's really a source of inspiration, good suggestion, and well-rooted experience in a participatory process. So it's really a pleasure and honor to have Simon with us in this project and today for this meeting, for this presentation. Just a few words about him. Simon is a senior associate of Involve. He has extensive experience in the fields of democratic reform, of government, public participation, of course, stakeholder engagement, accountability and transparency, scientific and technological innovation. He has worked at local and national level in Africa, Asia, and Europe. I would say also in UK. Of course, it's a joke because of the Brexit, as well as on related issues of global governance and democracy. Currently is leading an expansion of Involve's work on science and technology, focusing on developing more effective ways for citizens to be involved in the development and design application of new technological innovations, with a particular emphasis on data and artificial intelligence, which is definitely aligned with our last effort in Lombardy for our participatory research agenda setting exercise. And Simon, now we will talk about participatory research and innovation agenda setting. Welcome, Simon. The stage is yours.
Angela, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate it, and it's been great working with you, and then finally meeting most of you in Barcelona. So it was good that we got to do something face to face at least. So I'm going to be talking to you about participatory innovation agenda setting. I do have a slight tendency to talk very fast, so do just shout at me if I'm talking too fast. Because I really don't want to do that, and I realise that English is my first language, and so just let me know. So let me just quickly tell you something about Involve first of all, because I don't think I really got a chance to talk to you about that in Barcelona. So we are a charity, we're a not-for-profit organisation. We're entering the end of our second decade. We're 16, 17 years old, and our kind of core mission is to bring the public, bring people to the heart of decision making. What we want to be doing is giving people the power to take and influence the decisions that affect our lives. But we're aware that you can't empower citizens to do everything. Modern life is far too complicated. So we need to help institutions to harness that potential of public engagement, harness the potential of public knowledge, of public power, and so on. And then we want to support people and institutions to collaborate for social change, to make the world better. And we do this through three different mechanisms, really. The first is we make the case. We help deliver high quality public engagement processes, demonstrate what's possible. We work with academics to draw on the latest theory and evidence about where public engagement works and doesn't work. It's important to say it doesn't work in every case. We work with institutions to help to build their capacity and their knowledge, their ability to commission and deliver good engagement. And we help to pioneer practice, develop new forms of engagement where necessary, harness digital engagement, for example, or develop practice around citizens' assemblies and so on. I'll be talking a little bit about some of that later. So that's what we do. I thought I might tell you just a little bit about some of the work I've been doing specifically on science and technology innovation, just so you've got a sense of where I'm coming from. You can make sense of kind of where I'm drawing what I'm saying from. So we have been supporting the UK government's programme ScienceWise for the last decade or so. ScienceWise is a government programme and we are contracted to help them deliver it. ScienceWise is now run by our big research council, UKRI, and UKRI through the ScienceWise programme supports other bits of government departments, quangos, non-departmental public bodies, whatever you want to call them, to identify areas of science and technology innovation which will have an impact on society, and then to identify what sorts of questions can the public help answer and how might we deliver effective public engagement. So this is at national policy level around science and technology innovation, and ScienceWise has supported over 70 public dialogues now over the course of, again, 16-17 years. Secondly, if I can get my slide to move forward, we're involved with the global consortium that is delivering a citizens' assembly on genome editing. This is one of those areas of innovation. So genome editing is obviously a technology that's going to impact heavily on the world. There is a global policy debate happening, but there's also national policy debates happening. And so we're running a citizens' jury, in the UK that is part of a range of citizens' juries across the globe that will feed into a citizens' assembly that's going to be happening in Athens, hopefully sometime next year, slightly dependent on funding. So here we're trying to explore, well, how do you connect national policy debates to global policy debates? And I think that there may be some resonances here with the work of Transform, which is about how do we connect and how do we deal with national policy debates at a regional level, and how do we connect regional policy debates back up to the national level and even global level. We might come back to some of those questions about what's the room for manoeuvre, what sorts of decisions can you take at different levels, and what does that mean for public engagement. Then we've been working on climate issues, net zero issues for a number of years now, both at local level. We've been doing work in a London borough of Camden, down in the southwest of the UK, in Dorset and so on. But then also we ran the UK's Climate Assembly 2 years ago. Started before the pandemic, and we had to do a massive turn to be able to deliver the last weekend, the last couple of sessions online. And these are processes that are beginning to influence both local level and national level decision making around how we reach net zero. And then finally, a very different piece of work in Liverpool around data. So the debate about data 15 years ago was how should we use data? What are the principles and values that should infuse the way we use data? But now data really is infusing all of our lives. It's informing health and social care decisions. It's informing decisions about education, every aspect of our lives. And decisions using data are being delivered by all types of government. And Liverpool City Region is exploring, well, what does a community community engaged governance structure look like? So we're working with the Liverpool City region to think about, well, what governance do you need around data and how do you engage the public in that? So we're working, as you can see, across lots of different types of technologies, across different types of decisions, and thinking about how all of that plays into governance. And so it's all of that experience that I'm going to draw on now as I kind of talk you through thinking about participatory innovation agenda setting. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about three things. The first is just go back to basics and think about, well, what is engagement? What is this thing called deliberation? And then this new, not so new, but certainly new in terms of public consciousness, what are citizens' assemblies and where do they fit within this innovation agenda setting? Thinking a little bit about why involve citizens. And then thinking about how to design good engagement, on what and with who, and then just finally giving you some case studies. Does any of this actually make a difference? I'm going to stop part way through a couple of times to give you time to ask me questions and for a bit of discussion and so on. Hopefully that's what you're expecting, and if not, don't look too bored. So, what is engagement? Now, this is a little bit difficult because in the UK, this bit of my presentation makes sense because these are words that make sense in English, but you're going to be translating them into multiple languages. And so when you're hearing what I'm saying, I don't necessarily want you to be listening to the words. I want you to be listening to what I'm saying the words mean and then thinking about what they mean in your own language. Because in the UK, at least, these words are used in different ways. If you're in the health service, people in the health service hear words, the two words involve and engage, very differently to how people in a community development setting hear them and how people in other settings hear them. So these words mean different things in different bits of government context in the UK. I have no idea whether that's the same in Spain, in Italy, in Belgium and across Europe and the rest of the world. But I think you just need to be thinking about what do these words mean and why am I using them and what does that mean for how I'm using engagement. I would be very interested in the questions at the end of this section for you to kind of explore a little bit about this question about kind of what these words mean and what and how different people hear them. So that said, the kind of question of how we translate these words apart, separate from that, there are different levels of engagement, of engaging the public. At the left-hand side of the spectrum is that inform. That's about telling people. It's a one-way communication, providing people with information about what you're doing, about science and technology, about what these things mean. It may be public education or it may be informing people about what you're doing, but that's the kind of almost the basic. The second level is where you're consulting. So you know what decision you're taking, and what you're engaging on here is you're asking for public feedback on what you're going to be doing. These are probably quite closed questions. They might be yes/no questions, or they might be saying, well, should we do this or that? But they're going to be quite closed sets of questions. The third level is where you're working directly with the public. You're kind of beginning to bring them into the room as opposed to sending them sets of questions. And you're checking and you're asking what their concerns are. You're asking what their hopes about the future are, and you're wanting to make sure you understand them so you build that into the development of your policy. The next level is collaborate, which is where you're saying, well, look, these technologies offer us all sorts of potentials, but what are your visions for the future and how do these technologies fit with that? And what sorts of policies might we develop as we think about your visions for the future? And how then might we kind of actually really get into the detail of those policies so we can implement them? So as you can see, you're opening up the questions as you get through these levels of engagement. And then the final one is this notion of empowerment, where you're giving power directly to communities, the wider public, to actually make the decision. If we went back to the 60s and we thought about Einstein's ladder, this would be kind of presented in a kind of vertical way. And if you were at the bottom at the informing level, you'd be seen as being, this is bad engagement. We shouldn't be doing this. And what we should be doing is just empowering the public. We don't at Involve think like that, because we think all of these types of engagement are relevant and valid and useful as long as you're clear about why you're doing them, because you can't do any of these, for example, without informing the public about what you're doing. Informing is an absolutely critical element of any type of engagement that we do. And there are some sorts of decisions that are very complex and require you to balance all sorts of economic considerations, environmental considerations, political considerations, and it's just not possible to put those sorts of decisions solely in the hands of the community or the public. And you can think of all sorts of decisions around genome editing, for example, and so on, where you really couldn't be working with the community and saying, should we genome edit or should we do this sort of research? It's just not possible. So I don't think we want to be thinking I should be always shifting to empower. You may be doing exactly the right thing if you're doing involvement, and I'll come back to the question of how we know if we're doing the right thing I think it's the second section of what I'm going to talk about. So when we think about these words, what I really want you to think about is, what are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to hear and understand from the public? But when you tell the public that you're going to engage them, you're making a promise to them. And it's really important that you understand the promise that you're making and what promise the public hear from you. So here's that spectrum again. When you tell them you're going to inform them, what the public hear from you is, well, you're going to keep us informed. You're going to make sure that we're kept up to date with what you're doing, how the technology is developing, and critically, you're also going to be truthful. You're going to give us balanced information. You're not going to kind of lie to us, give us half the information. You're going to keep us informed regularly, and you're going to be truthful about what you say. If I can get the next one up. The second is, well, look, if we're going to be consulting you, we are going to keep you informed, but we're going to listen to what you tell us, to how you answer the questions. We're going to acknowledge the answers you give us, and we're going to provide feedback about what decision we made at the end, about how you changed the decision. And if you didn't change the decision, we're going to explain to you why you didn't change the decision. The third is, well, look, we're promising to work with you and to make sure that your hopes and your fears are reflected in the policies that we develop. And again, we're going to provide you feedback. And that notion of feedback, that feedback loop, is obviously really important. So here, when we're thinking about collaboration, we're going to be looking to you for advice and innovation in informing these decisions, in helping us to think about, well, what's the shape of the policy? What are we trying to achieve here? And we're going to incorporate those. We're going to include those, your hopes, your fears, your ideas about the future, into the decisions to the maximum extent possible. We are going to have to take into account other considerations like the economy, like politics and so on, but we're going to do as much as we can. And here, when we say we're going to empower you, really are going to have the final decision. And it's really important, this, because it's no good saying you're going to empower the public and then actually taking the decisions yourself. Because as you'll hear a bit later in what I'm saying, one of the reasons for doing engagement and doing it well is because you want to build more trustworthy decision making. You want to build trust of the public in the technology and in the decisions that you're taking about the technology. And if you make them a promise and then don't deliver on the promise, you're going to really reduce their trust. It will be better not to engage at all than to make a promise and then not deliver on it. And so we are often, when we're talking with government, both at national level and local level, saying, can you really deliver on this? Are you really able to ask the public this question and then deliver on the answers you're going to be getting back? And if you can't, then you really mustn't ask these questions, because you're going to reduce trust rather than increase trust. And I think that's a really, really critical point. Finally, I just thought for this little section, I've got 2 more slides. I thought I might give you just a little bit of kind of a few examples of what type of engagement happens at different points in the spectrum. So the first, I mean, obviously you'd be doing information awareness campaigns, you might be doing a social media campaign, you might be putting out videos and so on, you might be putting out pamphlets, you might be kind of standing in a marketplace and talking to people about what you're doing around climate change or what a technology is about. Here you might be publicising the policy that you're planning to implement and publishing a set of questions around that draft strategy or that draft consultation document. Here, well, at the involved level, you might be doing a citizens' assembly. You'd be saying, look, we've already agreed that we're going to be reaching net zero by 2050, and we'd be really interested in what you think about this policy, what your hopes about the policy, the fears about the policy are, what sorts of considerations you want us to take into account as we develop policy around net zero. So you'd be doing a citizens assembly. Here you'd be running co-production workshops. You'd probably have stakeholders and citizens. They'd be much smaller. You'd be having stakeholders, citizens, decision makers in the room together, actively working on developing a shared set of objectives, a shared set of outputs. And then finally, it might be the final stage of participatory budgeting, for example. So those are the examples of engagement across the spectrum. And when we're thinking about innovation agenda setting, I think we're really talking about that kind of middle of the middle of the spectrum, and we're really only going to be getting to collaborate, I think, largely probably when we're talking about implementing these decisions at the local level. So when we're thinking about net zero in a particular town, perhaps at a kind of slightly bigger regional level. It's possible that you might be doing it, collaborating at the national level with a set of stakeholders and national representatives of citizens groups, but I don't think you can do collaboration at the national level very easily with citizens, because when we're talking about countries of millions and millions of citizens, it's very difficult to imagine how you can really do collaboration. So you're more likely to be at that kind of involve and consult level. So, I'm kind of infusing a lot of our work as this notion of deliberative public engagement and co-production. So I thought I'd just kind of unpick what these two different terms mean. I first of all, and again, I'm going back into English words again, I do apologise, so think about the concepts that sit underneath them rather than the words themselves. Much of our public policy making is done through debate, where what you're trying to do is you're trying to beat down your opponent, you're trying to win the argument. You're not really interested in kind of sharing or collaborating. What you really want to be doing is just saying my ideas are best and I want to win, and the result you get is a win or a lose in that particular policy area. Dialogue is where you're beginning to kind of share thoughts, you're trying to understand each other's positions, you're trying to enlarge your understanding of what this policy means for different groups, different people, and begin to think about, well, what are those different understandings of that policy? What do they mean for the policy that I'm going to be implementing? And trying to then think about, well, how might I then kind of implement those as I'm implementing the policy? And then finally, this notion of deliberation is where you've opened up and you've enlarged your understanding of the policy area, the implications, who might win, who might lose. What you're trying to do then is balance up these different understandings and trying to reach a new consensus. You're hoping that you can reach a decision that everybody will agree with. What you are more likely to get in a very complex situation is something that is a win-win, is something that people can live with, rather than actually everybody wins. I was really struck. We were running it was a face-to-face, so it was pre-pandemic. So that kind of you can never remember whether something was pre-pandemic or not. There's this really big divide, isn't there, in time? So we were running some work in Cambridge as part of the Greater Cambridge. This took in quite a large geographic area around public transport, and we were running a citizens assembly on that. And I was watching the video afterwards of kind of what the process was like and what participants thought. And there was this one young man who was in his 20s who was reflecting at the end of the process, and he said, you know what, I really don't like where we've got to. I don't agree with where we've got to, but I can absolutely see why we got there, and I can see why this matters for everybody else, and I think this is the right decision. And I thought that was really striking, and that is exactly what where we're trying to get to with deliberation. We can't please everybody, but if we can run a process that is seen to be open, seen to be informed properly by evidence, and seen to involve the interests of as many groups as possible, people are much more likely to be able to live with the decision, because they can see why their loss is balanced by other people's gain. I think that's really important, and I think that's a key part of the sorts of decision making we're trying to get to when we're thinking about these complex questions around science and technology innovation and their implications on society. So what is just digging a bit further down into what does deliberation mean when we're in the room with people. There are three stages to a deliberative process. The first is where participants learn about the issue. They'll hear about the technological aspects. What is this technology? What's DNA? What does genome editing mean? What is climate change? What's net zero? What does that mean? They may hear from experts in terms of economics, environment, science, and so on. But they will also hear from people who have particular positions. So they're going to want to hear about what the different debates are. If we do this policy, it's going to mean a disaster for my industry. It's going to mean it's going to be really good because think of all the benefits. So they both want the evidence, but also the different components of the debate, so they can have a properly informed decision. Then they sit together and they think about the issue, and they think about, well, what have we heard here? And what does that mean for the questions that are going to be asked? Whose evidence do we want to take into account? What do we think? Do we need to ask more questions to really get underneath it, to begin to answer the questions that we've been asked? Can we call back an expert and say, can you explain that a bit more? What do you mean by this? And then they deliberate, they weigh up these different evidence, the different perspectives and views that they've heard through that dialogue, and they come to some sense of decision that will be some form of recommendation to government, whoever it is who's commissioned the Citizens' Assembly or deliberative process. And fundamentally, the difference in this type of deliberative process as opposed to many other types of engagement process is that difference in communication pattern. It is that kind of building up learning, then having that dialogue to open up your understanding of all the different positions, and then it's trying to close back down again to reach some form of decision that is hopefully that win-win, but is certainly, I can live with this decision. So, why are dialogue and deliberation different? When you think about a survey, what you normally get is you get an understanding of what participants say they want. What do you think about net zero? I hate it, I love it. I mean, that's a ridiculous question, but you know what I mean. And certainly deliberative processes will help you understand what participants want. We want to achieve net zero in this way. We want to be using genome editing in this way, and we don't want it in that way. But what deliberation in particular will do that most other forms of public engagement won't, is they will tell you why the public want it. Why do they want that particular decision? What sorts of values are they bringing in? They may be thinking about equity. They may be thinking about value for money. They may be thinking about what it means to be human, what a good life is, what does well-being mean for the future for me and my children. They may be thinking about sets of principles that need to be applied, or just bringing in perspectives. This will actually really negatively affect me and my community because they live on a coast and I can't live with it. This just doesn't work for me. So you'll be understanding kind of why participants are saying what they want. And then finally, often those things, so value for money and equity, are often in complete tension. You can't achieve one and the other very easily. So when you ask participants, well, actually, what should we decide in this particular situation? Then what you begin to see is how participants balance up those different values and principles and perspectives and what they actually value in a particular situation. And what that means is, even if you can't deliver them on that first level, what they say they want, you can reflect the values and how they balance those tensions and trade-offs in your decisions. So you may not be able to deliver them exactly the policy they want, but you can say equity is really important for you. So as we've implemented this policy, we've really emphasized equity, and here's how we've done it. So that you can be more in tune with public values and principles and perspectives. And this dialogue and deliberation helps you create space for a different type of decision. So when you're in that kind of debating position, that national shouting match in the Parliament chamber or on social media, what you're seeing are those different positions that may be quite far apart. But when you do deliberation and dialogue, what you can do is you can get below that visibility line into understanding where people's interests lie and what their values are, and often they overlap and they have a number of values and principles and interests in common, and that's where you can begin to build a new consensus for a potentially new position that looks something different. And it may be, if you've got long enough with them, and you can build enough trust, you can actually get to the point where people will talk about their deepest fears, their biggest hopes, their needs, that you can really begin to identify they share quite a lot in common, and then you can build a new consensus around that. So if you're in a debating position, well, your people are stuck in the position where they are. But if you can get to that point of deliberation in particular and identify those interests, you've got a new foundation for building a different position, a different policy. So I'm just going to quickly go into thinking about co-production and co-design, because these are other words that are used. And again, English words, and I suspect they're used very differently in your own country, but they do describe sets of concepts that sit underneath it. So co-design is where you're thinking about, well, how should we be doing something? You might be developing a recipe together, or drawing up a plan for how a new town should look like, or how a new development within a town should look like. What's the plan? What are we going to try and do? It might be developing a strategy for dealing with net zero, for example. So co-design occurs when more than one person, and normally more than one group, communities, stakeholders, policymakers, come together to draw up a plan for doing something. Co-production, on the other hand, is when you've got your plan and you're then putting it into practice. You're actually working together to make the cake if you've co-designed your recipe, or you're working together to actually build the buildings that are going to make up the new development, or you're working together to actually deliver net zero. And this is important because if we muddle up what we're doing, are we designing the plan or are we delivering it? It's actually very unclear for citizens in particular as to what it is they're contributing. And so it's very difficult for you to explain to them how their contribution has made a difference. And then we have this word co-creation in UK, which kind of includes both of those other terms. It's doing both of those things. So when you're thinking about the words that you're using, be thinking about what is it you're doing. Am I designing or am I producing? Or is the word I'm using, does everybody hear it to mean, well, I'm doing both? So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about, well, what does this deliberation what does deliberation look like in practice, through picking this notion of a citizens' assembly, which is kind of has really taken root, certainly in the UK and around the world, and is one of those kind of things that lots of people say they want to do now. And I thought it might be helpful just to talk to you a little bit about what a citizens' assembly actually looks like. So it's where you bring together members of the public together to hear about an issue, to learn in depth. We're in the learning phase there, to talk about that issue with people from all walks of life, and then collectively to reach a decision. So I've kind of described to you again what deliberation looks like. Citizens' assembly, it's important to say, is just one form of this deliberative mini public. Citizens' juries are another, much smaller. Consensus conferences is another. Consensus conference is something that's been going now since the 80s, started in Denmark, where you bring together policymakers and citizens. Planning cells started in Germany, deliberative polls, and then obviously citizens' assemblies. The key features are they've got a clear remit. There's a very clear question that they're being asked. What is it that citizens have got to ask, and what output do you want at the end? What is it that citizens are doing? Are they giving you a yes/no answer to a question with a set of reasons as to how they reached it? Or are they giving you a set of recommendations about how you might implement a policy? It has clear institutional ownership. There's a clear organisation, whether it's a government department or a parliament or a business or whoever, who actually has commissioned this and owns it and commits to acting on the output. There's independent oversight because, of course, most of these areas are very political, and it's possible to present evidence that will bias the jury, bias the assembly. So what you want to be able to do is to demonstrate that they really have been having as much as possible neutral evidence, and they've been seeing a balanced set of experts and views across the different arguments. And so you want to be having an independent oversight group that will include stakeholders from different perspectives of the argument and experts to make sure that the question is a neutral question, that the evidence will properly inform the assembly, and that the process is balanced. You want to be randomly selecting the citizens so that you do get this really broad set of a sample who sit within the citizens' assembly that broadly reflect what the demographics of the of the wider population looks like, and therefore they all demographically represent the wider population. For many of these assemblies, we do just look for a group of public who sit in the assembly who look like the wider public in terms of age, gender, socioeconomic group, ethnic makeup, and so on. But for some, you might also want to do some attitudinal questions. So if we have very good polling on what the wider public perspective is on net zero, on gene editing, you might want to be recruiting a group of public that broadly reflects that you get the percentage of people who are really worried about net zero and the percentage of people who don't believe that climate change is real, so that you've got that kind of reflective sample within the wider group. We ran an assembly in 2018, I think it was, on Brexit, where we had a group of people, 52% had voted no, 48% had voted yes, so that we reflected the wider group of what the result in the referendum looked like. If I can move forwards. So the key features in delivery, I've already said, you've got balanced information, you've got expert witnesses. Really, really important, you give people time. You can't kind of give them an hour to think about what they've heard. You need to be giving them a lot of time, and you need to be building that time into the process. And that's where that independent oversight can be so important. They can be helping you think, have you got the balance of the process right? Are people just getting so much information and having no time to understand it, they can't give you an informed decision? You need to have that impartial facilitation. Facilitators who don't have any skin in the game, who aren't part of the policy making, aren't part of that kind of wider political debate. And then there needs to be collective decision making. That you need to be having the assembly as a whole making decisions, and you'll be doing that through having whole assembly voting, discussing the outcome of the vote, thinking about it, re-voting again, making sure that you're kind of building that consensus around the decision making. And then key features in the follow-up, there'll be the assembly will make a public report that is published, and so anybody can see it, and it's handed over to the policymakers. The policymakers will then consider it in the right forum. It might be in Parliament, it might be in an expert group, and then there will be a formal response back to the Citizens' Assembly saying, this is what we heard you say, and this is what we're going to do as a result of what you've said. So how many people? Well, there isn't really a hard and fast rule. There are different types of process. You might have citizens' juries, which are kind of somewhere between 12 to 24. They might creep up to 30, but any more than 30, and it stops being a citizens' jury because you can't run the process in quite the same way. Citizens' assemblies are between 50 and 250, and then these deliberative polls are larger still, 100 to 600. Back in the 2010s, America Speaks was running big kind of citizens' assembly type processes, although they weren't quite the same, with 1,000 people in the room. So you can do these things very big if you've got the money and space and time to do it. But numbers don't necessarily bring you more robustness or more legitimacy, and we might want to reflect on that a little bit later. How much time? No hard and fast rule. You've got to allow sufficient learning and deliberation for a task. In terms of citizens' assemblies, you need to involve at least 2 days, but often more. And it would have to be a very tight question with a very small amount of evidence. If you're going to be doing a 2-day citizens' assembly, you're probably going to need at least 4 full weekends for something like net zero, for example. And a citizens' jury, this one that we're running on genome editing, we've got 4 full days just looking at one aspect of genome editing, human heritable genome editing, not looking at all the plants, animals, just that one thing in 4 days. So they can be quite time consuming because you really do need to get into the detail. Okay, so I feel like I've talked for an awful lot of time there. I'm going to come off share and ask you whether there are any questions or thoughts or comments.
Thanks a lot, Simon. A lot of really inspiring examples also. I have a couple of questions. I don't know if there are any other comments, urgent comments. One is on the feedback received by the young guy for the citizen assembly in the Cambridge area, and so the comment that he made that I think it's really striking, and it's a sort of response all the conflicts also about the idea of the consensus for the deliberative processes, because there is a debate, especially in academia, that this kind of approaches tend to get the consensus, and sometimes it's really impossible to get the consensus, and this means that all the marginalized voices and experiences can be taken into account. But this is, I think, that this comment coming from this participant is really the nature and essence of the deliberation. So you can be also not on the same idea of the consensus at the end of the process, but you can see the value and really the meaning of such processes. And yeah, if you could elaborate a little bit on this, I think this is a crucial element on the deliberative processes, so on the consensus. And also the information phase, I think it's relevant not only for citizens, because of course they can learn also a lot on very specific and technical issue, but is a relevant phase also for all the external viewers of these processes, for the policymakers as well, for all the stakeholders involved in the research and innovation that very often are very skeptical about the value of this exercise, because at the end they think that citizens cannot really decide, elaborate good decisions or suggestions or recommendations to regulate so complex topics like science and technology. But the informative phase, I think it is the entry point also for stakeholders to be involved, and so to see directly the value of these exercises, and also to to know that this process is not just to ask randomly to citizens, oh, how do you want to regulate science and technology, but there is a complex process, very well thought and planned with independent information. So it's something that you can consider to be used to better regulate science and technology. So I'll comment on this, please.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think when many policymakers and scientists and other experts hear that the public might be involved, their worry is that it's going to look like social media with lots of ill-informed comment that doesn't really understand the science or their economics and or other people's positions. And so it can be quite reassuring for people to hear that these will be properly informed, that there will be kind of this independent oversight, and that will be kind of robust evidence going in to inform them. And I think that you're right around the kind of this question of kind of what sorts of decisions can these types of processes make, and this kind of notion of consensus. I think it's really important though to think also about the limitations of deliberative processes. So and why they're valuable despite those limitations. So because you might only have 100, or even in a deliberative poll 600 people, you can't have 100 people or 600 people possibly representing the whole diversity of the UK or of Spain or of any country in Europe, really. What you can be doing is you're opening up and you're diversifying the sets of perspectives. But, you will only have, you may only have 3 or 4 people from particular minority backgrounds, but those communities are large and they have a huge diversity of opinion, and you can't possibly expect 5 people from a particular community to represent the diversity of views across their whole community. So, but what you are doing is you're opening up your understanding of how different people respond. And critically, you're doing it in public, and what you're doing, you're making the process open, you're showing the process of how a decision has been reached. And I think that's one of the real powers of these sorts of deliberative methodologies, is it's by opening up and making transparent the process, you're helping build trust in the process itself. You may actually, if you did it in, behind the walls of your ministry, not really come to a very different decision. There will be definitely differences, but in broad thrust it may not look very different, but it's that process of doing it in the open that then begins to build that more trustworthy governance. And I think that's a really, really important element of it, because you could imagine that young man in Cambridge seeing the very same decision that had been taken behind the closed walls of the local council, going, well, I hate this, and now I'm out on the streets and I'm never going to vote for you again. Whereas he can now understand why it was reached, and he may not be completely happy, but actually he can live with it. And I think that's what's really important with these things. Has anybody got any other vital question before I move on to the next stage? I can see a comment. I don't know whether that was earlier on. Oh, thanks, Julia. Yes, Thomas.
Maybe, I don't know if this is, you set the bar very high with calling the question vital. I don't know if it's vital. I was just thinking, since you talked about kind of the use of evidence, so how do you deal with uncertainties? Because some evidence is not always conclusive, right? And I'm asking this against the background of something my colleagues did in Vienna, also in the broad area of deliberative mini-publics, and they came to recognize that the more open scientists, especially as experts, were about the uncertainties, the more trust they got from the citizens, basically. So I was wondering how this kind of plays out in those bigger deliberative formats.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely vital, because the uncertainty is a key part. These decisions will be much easier when we may not need to be involving the public if there's no uncertainty, but it's actually the uncertainty that is the problem. There's uncertainty in the science, and there's uncertainty in the impacts of the decisions that we might take on the science. So you're layering uncertainty on top of uncertainty. And so, I mean, the way you do it is partly through picking the right experts who are able to talk confidently in a way the public can understand, but also are willing and able to reflect the uncertainty themselves, and to be clear about what is certain and what is not certain, and to be able to live with that uncertainty. And then it's a case of just kind of being very clear with the public about that level of uncertainty and what it means for the sorts of decisions that they're making. It's very difficult to talk in the abstract about these things, but then it's about thinking about, well, I guess it's another reason why that second level that deliberation can get you to, the values and principles and perspectives that underpin what it is the public say, are so important, because the science might change, or our understanding of what impact the decision might have might change. Understanding why people have reached the decision helps you to change the decision as that uncertainty unfolds and you begin to get more knowledge and the impacts are clearer. So I think that you deal with it by having the right experts in the room and being able to live with the uncertainty in the room, but also by trying to get to those values and principles so you can kind of change direction as you go. I'm going to go on to I'm suddenly aware I've been talking for slightly longer than I was expecting to, so there's a risk I won't get to the end, and I definitely want to do that too. So let me move on, and then there's two more chances for questions. So I'm just going to unpack why we want to be involving citizens. So the first is that, these are very complex decisions. These are decisions, whatever decision we make in these sorts of areas, whether we're going to be making decisions about how we reach net zero by putting wind farms somewhere, or by restricting traffic in a certain area, or by not investing in oil and coal anymore, or in genome editing, whether we're going to be investing in research for this disease but not that disease. there are groups who are going to win and lose, and politicians are often very worried about that winning and losing, and they're very worried that they whatever decision they make, somebody is going to complain about it. And what politicians often misunderstand or underestimate is where the public's concern and support lies around innovation. They often think the public are going to hate this, but we almost always find that the public give a contingent yes. We're happy for you to proceed, but only on these terms. And this is important. It's important to remember who politicians are. They're very public figures. When they walk down the street, the public recognise them and know who they are. But the public who come up and talk to them are public who've got a very strong opinion about something, and they often want to tell them something and wave, metaphorically wave their finger in their face and say, don't do this. So their position is that what they hear the edges of the debate. And those of us who are not so sure, well, we're not the ones who walk up to the politician and go, well, I think this, but I also think that, because and so they only ever see the edges of the debate. And so they think the public is really split and they think everybody is going to hate them. When you bring the public together, the politicians can begin to see there is a place where I can create consensus, and I am going to be able to create a mandate. I'm still going to be having that person who walks up to me shouting at me, but actually if I do it in this way, I'm more likely to get support. So it's important to remember the place that politicians have in society and why they react to complex debates in the way they do, because it helps you think about how you talk to them about these processes. But it also gives politicians and civil servants a chance to test where the public stands and to hear, well, if I did this, what do you think? But if I went a bit further, is that too far? Secondly, the public have got lots of experience. You've got scientists and other expertise in the room. We're talking about complex areas of science that just aren't about atmospheric science or aren't just about the understanding of DNA. They're about how health systems work. They're about how energy systems work. There's lots of expertise of that kind of technical kind within society, but there's also expertise about people's lives that actually, I know you want to change the road system here, but that means that this whole group of people will never be able to get to hospital. So you can't change the thing in that way. You're going to have to take account of how people's lives are lived, because otherwise you are going to build up that opposition. So you've got different kinds of expertise and lived experience in the room, and it's through exposing that and bringing that into the decision-making process that you will make a much better decision. People are also very creative. They can help you think through different ways to talk about the issue. They can help you think through different ways to actually think about the issue and achieve a policy end. And they can then also, they've got loads of energy, and if the public believe you're doing something that's in their interests, they may actually want to help you deliver it. If you think about our response to Ukraine, for example, and refugees coming into Europe in Ukraine, this isn't something that's been delivered just by governments opening up and giving Ukrainians visas. You've got all sorts of citizens group connecting Ukrainians to hosts, supporting them with food and so on. So the creativity of citizens can help you deliver all these policies. The same in climate change. The town where I live, there's a community group that is putting solar panels on the roofs of community buildings, not run by government at all. So policies can be implemented by citizens as much as by government. The groups that are most likely to be impacted by your decisions are also the most likely to be ignored and listened to, because they're the hardest to reach. Well, I would never say they're the hardest to reach. They're often the hardest to listen to because they've got the most difficult things to say about how your policy will implement them. And because they're going to be more disproportionately affected, you're going to want to be listening to them for the normative reason it's the right thing to do. But actually, because if you get the policy right, their lives will be improved. And they will require fewer public services. There's an instrumental reason. Often, if you get the policy wrong, people with disabilities or with other needs from the community will often require more intervention later that will be much more costly than if you get the policy right. So it's the right thing to do. It will make people's lives better, and it will save the public purse money. And then finally, it can help build trust. So we've already talked about making these processes open, making decision making more legitimate. People can see how their views are reflected in the policy, and therefore they can say, well, okay, I can see that people like me were involved, and actually that makes a difference to me. And then you're developing policies that I talk about going with the grain of public opinion. They meet public expectations of fairness, of equity, or whatever it is that's important to them. And then people are also more likely to develop that shared ownership of the problem and the solution. I can see why this problem is important. I can see why you've reached this decision, and I'm happy, and I may even help you deliver it. It builds awareness. It will help others to act. It builds awareness. Will develop a sense of shared ownership, as I've already said. It'll help build skills and confidence to actually kind of act on the problem and work together. And those policies will work with public's lives, so they're much more likely to kind of act and help you deliver them. But they're not; these aren't easy processes to deliver at all. You can't just turn around in the morning and say, I want to deliver a citizens' assembly. I mean, we too often get people saying, we really, really want to involve the public in this process. We'd like to do a citizens' assembly, and can we do it next month, please? Well, no, you can't, because if you're going to get that diverse range of really properly informed evidence, we need to get the experts, and the right experts are very busy. We can do it in 5 months' time, but not a month. The public are busy, they're taking granny to hospital, they're taking the kids to school, they work. Of course they can't just drop everything and do it on your timeline. You've got to give them time. And actually, you've got to be able to have the right networks to get the right experts in. So you need capacity and skills to commission effective public engagement, and you need to give it time. Badly planned engagement doesn't have the right people in the room, that you're not giving people enough time, you're not thinking about what the output is going to look like. But it can also be badly planned because the institution itself hasn't thought about how it's going to respond. It hasn't got that kind of, once we've got the output, what are we going to do with it? And so when we're supporting decision makers to think about the engagement they want to commission, we're always saying, why are you asking this question? What's the output you're going to get? And who's going to get that output on their desk? And what are they going to do with it? What decision are they going to then take on the back of the evidence that they get from what the public think? And therefore, the questions you're asking are the wrong questions, because the policymakers can't act on the evidence they're going to generate. You need to ask different questions informed by different experts so that you deliver an output that the institution can actually act on. And don't forget, our politicians come and go. So how are you going to deliver an output that will be recognised by everybody across, well, maybe not everybody, but the majority of people across the political spectrum? Public participation slows decision making down. I want to do this in a month. Well, you can't do it in a month. You're going to have to slow your decision making process down. But you know what? The classic example we would use is the expansion of Heathrow Airport, where we've been trying to expand Heathrow Airport for the last 20 years, and it keeps going back to the courts, back to judicial review, because they haven't taken into account all of the different factors. And actually, if they'd done a proper deliberation right at the start, maybe we would have something that would have met the needs of all the stakeholders who live around Heathrow, of the airlines, of the travellers. But the decision has been slowed because they've never stopped and thought about who do we need to involve in this. And it's the same across wind farms, same across genetic modification. I would argue that the European public rejected genetic modification partly because they were worried about the science, but at least as much because they were worried about the impact on the natural landscape, the impact on the economy, the impact on farmers, whether the right products were coming through, were the products right for supermarkets or were they right for the consumer? And if we'd had a proper deliberation across Europe that said these are the sorts of products we want and we want you to make sure that these safeguards are put in place, I think it's more likely that genetic modification would have been accepted. But instead, the policy's been delayed indefinitely. So yes, it takes time, but you will save time in the long run if it's a very complex and controversial decision. Groups affected by innovation face systemic barriers. They're more likely to be ethnic minorities, people with disability, people who are marginalised by society, and you really have to think about that. It may well be that a citizens' assembly isn't a safe space for some of those most minority groups. You know, there are some decisions you might think about where Roma community across the whole of Europe would not feel safe to come into it. So you may have to think about how you involve those particularly marginalised and stigmatised groups in a different way in addition to the Citizens' Assembly, for example. So when you're thinking about engagement, you need to think about how you link different forms of engagement and how one form of engagement might inform another, or do you need an expert who can represent the views of that community in the engagement that you're running? And then kind of national and even regional innovation communication has some unhelpful ways of thinking about it. So there are assumptions about how scientifically literate people are. There are also assumptions about how much science people really need to know. I mean, I would argue you can probably talk about genome editing in about 6 or 7 sentences, and people don't need to understand the mechanics of the enzymes and what a cell nucleus looks like, because the conversation we're having isn't about the science, it's about the impact of the science on society. It doesn't mean we don't need to talk about it, but it does mean we don't need to bring the public up to the expert level of actually being able to pull out a pipette and whack in the right microliters of a particular enzyme. There's often a focus on the problem and not on the visions for the future. And we focus on the negatives and not the positives. The public are often have positive and negative perspectives on a technology. And we need to think about how we present the positives and the negatives. Right, I really am going to have to rush now. I'm spending too long on each slide. So it's really important we think about what is up for change. With any decision as complex as those involved in science and technology, there are things that can't change. You're subject to the law, you're subject to the laws of physics, economics, politics. There are some things that can change that are negotiable and some things that are open for change. And before you do any commissioning of engagement, you have to be really clear with yourself what can change and what can't. You cannot go to the public saying, asking a question that you're legally not allowed to do, because you're then going right back to not being able to act on their decision, act on what they tell you at the end. You can only ask them questions on the negotiable and open parts of the conversation. And that can be really hard, because you can feel like, well, I don't want to tell the public I can't do this, but if you can't be honest with the public, you shouldn't be engaging them, frankly. That's one of my things I often tell people, maybe not quite as bluntly as that, but you have to be able to be completely open. It comes back to Thomas's question about the uncertainty. If you can't be open about the uncertainty and the law and everything else that's constraining you, you shouldn't be engaging. People often say, I want to do a citizens' assembly, I want to do a citizens' jury, I need an online forum, and I want to get this outcome. That is absolutely the wrong way to think about it. You will often find you get a very bad outcome as a result of that. You have to think about, why am I doing this? First of all, what is it what's the decision? What is it I need out of it? Why am I engaging the public? What's the public debate about this? What is the context already? What's the evidence? Who's talking about it? What do the public know? What do they not know? That will change your purpose. This is an iterative. I'm not a mathematician. I don't know how to show an iterative equation, so I can't show this as iterative. And then and only then do you think about the people that you need to involve, and then and only then do you think about the process, because it's informed by everything else. You may end up with a citizens' assembly, but you may end up with something very different, or you may end up with a citizens' assembly that involves other forms of engagement too. So you're going to do different forms of engagement at different points in the policy cycle. We all know the policy cycle is not this idealized form. It's incredibly messy, but thinking about it in this idealized form can help you think about what you're doing. Are you in the political visioning stage? Well, in that case, you're going to be doing kind of much more open, deliberative type processes, future search, mapping an issue, mapping a geographic area, visioning. Then when you're getting into that policy forum, you're getting into citizens panels, deliberative citizens assemblies, perhaps focus groups, dialogues, polling. Then when you're developing the policy processes, well, you might be doing some co-production with a very narrow group of people. You're much more likely doing kind of consulting in terms of kind of very narrow questions, yes, no type questions. When you're decision making, unless you're doing a properly empowered process like participatory budgeting, you're just informing people about who's taking the decision, where they're taking it, what decision they've taken. And then in implementation, well, you might be doing some of that co-production type stuff, or you might be just doing extractive one-way evaluation of how the policy is going, and then you go back round again. So be thinking about what type of question, how open is the question, because that will affect the type of engagement that you're doing. And then I've just put this in. We'll share the slides at the end, but you might this sort of little worksheet might help you think about kind of step by step, kind of think about the engagement that you might want to be commissioning. So I'm going to stop here briefly for questions and comments. If you don't have any, don't worry.
A very quick question about institutional ownership of this kind of deliberative processes, because now we are seeing that so many citizen assemblies are flourishing across Europe, and not all the citizen assembly are run or not involved policymakers, so are really bottom-up citizen assembly exercises with Extinction Rebellion and other grassroots movements to plan, run, and ground this kind of exercise. So in the end, what is the result of these approaches? In some cases, some policymakers decided at the end or in the midst of the planning and implementation of the citizen assemblies to be involved or to be part of this process. So they will take the results and use somehow, but of course they were not at the very beginning of the process, and there was no initial commitment on how to use the results. So what is your idea about these very bottom-up exercises, also in case of citizen assemblies that entails to have so many citizens, so many participants involved in?
And I think that comes back to that slide a little bit earlier about kind of what's the decision that's open or closed or whatever. And there, you need to be very clear about the power that you have to act on a decision. So, if you're talking about a government department or a regional administration or whatever, you're clear about the power you have to act on it. I'm not against groups like Extinction Rebellion or community citizens assemblies at all, but they have to be very clear with themselves and with the people they're engaging that what we can do is we can engage you around the sorts of activities that we should be doing. So those are the things that are completely in your control, or on what we should be campaigning on. We can't promise you the government is going to act on it, but what we can promise you is that we will take your messages to government and we will talk to government about what you've said. So I'm not against Extinction Rebellion doing it, but the promise has to be a real promise that Extinction Rebellion or whoever the community group can deliver on. I would be very wary about starting a commissioning process and then having lots of other groups coming in, because if you haven't got the framing right at the start for all of the groups who are involved in the commissioning, then having new aims and objectives brought in halfway through will make the delivery very, very difficult, because it's Extinction Rebellion, just to pick that example again, is very different having the government of Catalonia also involved, because the government of Catalonia has got far more restrictions on what it can do than Extinction Rebellion, and so having coming in halfway through, the process is unlikely to work for both parties. So I would say if you're going to be delivering a process, you've got to have all of the actors in place at the start, and that's one of the reasons that these processes can take so long to get off the ground, because it's that negotiation between the different stakeholders who are commissioning the process that takes the time, even if you're talking just about government. So, for example, if you've got the Department of Transport and the Department of Environment, they've got very different responsibilities, and the ministers will be very different, perhaps have different political views. And so the conversation needs to be at least as much about how do we balance those views and get an assembly that will deliver for both of those departments, before you can even start the commissioning, and it's in that the conversation takes the time. I've been involved in some of these science-wise dialogues that have taken 18 months from us being approached by a government department saying we want to commission something on this to actually it happening. Because when you start saying, well, what decision are you actually informing? Who's going to be making the decision? What are they worried about? What are the risks that we need to mitigate as we design this process? Who do they need to hear from? Suddenly they start going, oh, I'm not really sure what decision I'm commissioning, or, it's never quite as bad as that, but, oh, I hadn't thought about that risk. We're going to have to go back to the minister and think about, well, can we really involve this stakeholder? For example, it may be politically contentious to involve a particular stakeholder in providing information. So these things can take a long time because you need to get all that framing right from the start.
Thank you.
Any other questions, or shall I? My next stage is just to very, very quickly go through a few case studies and to talk about kind of where these things have had impact. Shall I do that? Okay, at least I think that's where I'm going next. It's always exciting when you're doing a long presentation. Never quite sure where it's going. Right, what I want to do is draw from ScienceWise, which I talked to you about at the beginning. It says there we've supported over 50 public dialogues. I think that's slightly out of date. I think it's more like 60, 65. And they're across a huge range of areas, as you can see there, from climate, environment, data, health and aging, life sciences, and then a number of other, almost every aspect of science and technology over the course of the last 20 years or so. So ScienceWise is a UKRI funded programme which is also supported by the Department for Business, and the aim is to provide evidence on public aspirations, concerns, views and values. Aspirations and concerns, note there, it's not just about their fears, it's about what they want from the technology too, where their hopes lie, around new and emerging areas of science and technology, along with views about potential benefits and advantages, critically to feed into research and policy making. And ScienceWise does that by supporting the commissioning of deliberative public dialogue to support that research policy development. So I'm going to give you a few short examples of a few projects and then a couple of slightly more detailed examples. So the first is around data science ethics. So ScienceWise has supported probably around 10 or slightly more than 10 public dialogues around different aspects of data. But one that I've picked out here is around data science ethics. So the Government Digital Service back in 2015 was developing a framework to help data scientists to think about the ethics of whether they should be using data in the particular way they were considering. And they developed the framework and they wanted to use a public dialogue to explore, well, to what extent does this framework reflect the values and the principles of the public as they think about the ethics of implementing data science projects. And so this project involved some deliberative public workshops in 4 locations as well as an online survey, and the output of it informed informed and helped shape the final framework that is now being used by Government Digital Service to think about which data projects should be commissioned and which should not be. The use of drones in the UK. This was a public dialogue commissioned by the Department for Transport, DFT, and the Ministry of Defence to explore public's understanding of drones and what their attitudes were. I haven't got a date on here, but again, I think this was back in about 2015. So thinking both about the current perspectives on how drones should be used, but also thinking about, well, what might happen with this technology in the future. And again, thinking about this involved both workshops in 5 locations and involved 118 members of the public. And this was to not inform a policy, but inform a consultation. So as you think about the sorts of things you might inform frameworks for decision making. You may not even inform a policy. What you might inform is a consultation around a policy, as opposed. So there are lots of different ways you can be doing this and using these types of engagement. Two more shorter ones. Synthetic biology. This is this new form of biology where we can begin to create new forms of life. So Craig Ventnor has recreated from scratch a particular bacterium, for example, from the DNA, and kind of creating the cell wall from scratch. And a large group of stakeholders, our Biology and Biological Sciences Research Council, and our Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. I remember the acronyms. So two of our research councils commissioned this public dialogue over the course of 2 years. So it's a big piece of work, but with lots of industry partners and a couple of central government partners as well. A big public dialogue, looking very upstream. The technology was just being developed, and what they wanted to develop was a roadmap to say, well, how should this policy develop? What sorts of things should we be thinking about as we think quite a long way into the future? And so this process involved these in-depth workshops with stakeholders, interviews with stakeholders, plus reconvened deliberative workshops in 4 locations to inform the roadmap that then informed the investment in the research and the development by both industry and the research councils in this technology. And then finally, one of my shorter examples is trajectories for carbon emissions. So this is back in 2013 now. Our Committee on Climate Change, which is an independent committee to make recommendations and hold government account around the commitment to net zero, was developing the committee's advice on our 4th carbon budget. And so this dialogue provided support around the types of recommendations for how the government should achieve its 4th carbon budget. So again, informing advice about how to reach net zero. So you've got 4 different types of kind of information that a dialogue can provide. It can inform advice that one bit of government gives another bit of government. It can inform a roadmap for developing future technology. It can inform a consultation. It can form a framework for thinking about decision making. But it can also inform direct decisions. So my next one is around mitochondrial replacement. So this is a disease that affects roughly 100 families a year, where the mitochondria don't work effectively, and children are born who die early and are affected by hugely debilitative diseases. But these mitochondria contain DNA, and the law at the time didn't allow you to make changes to any form of DNA, whether in the nucleus or in the mitochondria. But it should be possible. Was technically possible to take the nucleus out of the mother's egg and to put it into a donor's egg where the mitochondria work properly, and then to have a baby that is related to the mother. But that wasn't legal. So the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, working with our Department of Health, wanted to explore whether the public were actually happy for the law to change and for this genetic inheritance to pass down the generations. So the public dialogue, supported by ScienceWise, explored the ethical aspects and issues involved with this mitochondrial transfer, and what the practical implications were of allowing techniques. So there were 3 times 2 sets of dialogue workshops across the country involving 90 members of the public, scientists and bioethicists, but there was a much wider engagement, including open consultation, public meetings, focus groups and surveys. So a lot of engagement, all interlinked and feeding into each other. Over 3,000 people were involved, not in the dialogue workshops, but overall. And what the outcome of that was that whereas there was some concern amongst policymakers that there would be a backlash and the public wouldn't support it, actually what it demonstrated was that there was support for this technology, for this change to the law, but there were some restrictions. Parents shouldn't be forced to do it. They should have consent as to whether to do it. They need to have the right information to do it. It needs to be properly regulated. It can't be a free-for-all. Anybody can offer this technology. Parents must be offered counselling. Donor's identity needs to be protected. And it can't be used for anything else than to produce a healthy child, this worry about the slippery slope. And this informed and led to the new legislation, and the law has now changed, and it's now legal to offer mitochondrial transfer under these circumstances. And this quote from the HEFEA says that deliberative public dialogue helped enormously to formulate the policy advice we gave government. It provided serious backbone to that assessment, so it gave us the confidence to that assessment and led directly to the law being changed. So that's the first long example, and there we go. Oh, I'm going backwards, which is unhelpful. I thought I had 2 examples. I've only got 1. So we've got about 10 minutes left, so I haven't overshot, which I was worried about. I'm going to take a deep breath, have a drink of water. Have you got any questions or thoughts on the whole thing or on the case studies?
The mitochondrial gene replacement exercise is incredible because apart from the number of the participants involved, but really entailed a lot of different activities, and you say that each step of the process and the results of the process was included in the next step. So also the planning of this thing, I think, was absolutely crazy. And yeah, just to have a rough estimation of the people involved in the organization, in the planning and the implementation of this big exercise, how many people were involved in this?
So I wasn't involved in that. That was before my time of being involved in the way I am now in the process. So in terms of kind of, you know, your kind of average science-wise public dialogue, there will be probably a team of 3 or 4 people working part-time from a government department of a dialogue that might involve 50 or 100 people. You'll have an oversight group that will have somewhere between, you know, maybe 8 at the low end, 15 at the high end, who are going to meet 3 or 4 times during the process. You'll have a set of experts that might number anywhere between, you know, 6 and 15 or 20. You'll also be wanting to involve so there'll be that kind of central team that might be 3 or 4 people, but you'll be bringing in political advisors, you'll be bringing in communications experts, you'll be bringing in both people who can help you kind of communicate with the public, but also your government department is going to have to be thinking about how we're talking about this, when's the press release going out, so the comms department so you're probably talking about the core, and then the commissioning organisation itself will have 5 or 6 people involved in it, well 3, 4, 5 depending on how big it is. So you're probably talking about a core team of 10 and maybe 20 people involved overall at the core team.
So yeah, quite a big team to run everything, of course, for all these phases and all the stages.
Just on that note, and all of that begins to make this seem unachievable and very difficult to do. But that's why we really need to be looking for where are the most complex and controversial decisions where I cannot move forward, but it's so important that I move forward for society that if I can't make a decision here, the world will be a worse place. That's how the question for those of you inside institutions or trying to get government departments to commission these things is, how do you focus minds on this is an important question and it's worth spending 6 months planning and 8 months delivering, because your life will be easier at the end of this process. So it's how do you focus attention to say this is an important decision right now that we need to bring all these people together.
UK people are quite used to be involved, or they can receive this letter or invitation to join this kind of workshops. So perhaps it's easier to obtain the right number of the citizens to be present in the workshop, because one of the problem in this kind of exercises, so especially in the territories in which there is no past experience in this kind of approaches, that you send out a lot of invitation for citizens when you, of course, are running this kind of exercise, and you use the civic lottery to randomly select citizens, but at the end you receive back a few responses from citizens to be ready and happy to join the conversation. So it's easier for this kind of exercise in UK to have a high response from people, or it's quite the same because it's the normal process of democracy of conducting this kind of approaches.
Although we've had some very high profile assemblies, I think one of the limitations of these assemblies is that not very many people in the public actually know they've happened. So I wouldn't oversell how well embedded these are within the British public psyche at all. It would be interesting. I wonder whether, so the response rate we get, I think, is somewhere around 5%. Depends on the process, between 2 and 5%. There are these are difficult processes to pull together. For the bigger processes, you might send out 30,000 letters. They're not. I wouldn't oversell how easy it is here. I can see Rosa and Julia, and I'm slightly aware of time. Oh, Rosa, we can't hear you, or at least I can't hear you.
Yep. No, it seems you are not mute, but we cannot hear you.
No. I might go. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I will try to get closer to the microphone. I was wondering if this has any connection at all with the post office that also produce these policy briefs to inform policies, because I remember that they produce a policy brief for these children that you can have with 3 different parents, let's say. And it was a successful story because the UK was the first country that had a law that allowed that this process to happen. And I don't know if this is connected somehow. And how do you select the topics for your case studies? Are they bottom up, or depends on the case? Or this is my question.
So post the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology, as opposed to our post office that delivers mail, they haven't been involved, I don't think. It's just possible they were involved in the Climate Assembly, because I wasn't involved in the delivery of that on our side. But no, they haven't been, and partly because they sit in the position of providing information in Parliament. They're not responsible for doing outward engagement in any way, so they haven't been involved in any of these processes to any extent, apart from writing about them. In terms of science-wise commissioning these processes, and indeed the processes that Involve is interested in, we are interested in who is holding power, and so they're not bottom up. They are very much where a policymaker identifies that they have a problem, and we then try to open up that problem so that more voices can be heard in them. Sometimes they're bottom up in the sense that policymakers are aware there's a lot of public anger or interest in an issue, and that they're aware that they're finding a decision difficult to take, but from an Involve and science-wise perspective, they're always generated by government. Julia.
To start with, thank you so much. It was very comprehensive, concise, and enlightening at the same time. So thank you so much. And I was wondering, when I was hearing you, I thought maybe we were all wrong when we thought responsible innovation was also for enterprises, because it really seems that this is just way too big for any company, no matter how big, to set up and to make use of in a way that is systemic and systematic. Because so and starting from this, which is more of a comment than a question, I was wondering whether there's kind of a minimum scale or a minimum scope that makes this kind of exercises meaningful. And this also ties to what you were saying at the beginning, the use that we make of these words, participation and stakeholder engagement, because At least here in Italy, we labeled stakeholder engagement almost everything. Whereby, for instance, when the local or the city councillor for culture convenes stakeholder to set up a shared agenda of, I don't know, cultural events, that is not stakeholder engagement, and probably we should stop labeling it like that. So I was trying to understand where is the border between, let's say, design thinking and what you were just talking about? Where would you set this border so that we start, giving the right names to different things?
Three very challenging questions there. On the first question about kind of the role of enterprises and so on, or your comment, I mean, I think you're right. I think it's very difficult for an individual business to commission one of these things, because in the end they have a profit motive and they want to develop a product that they can sell, and they want to make money. But I do think that there are many enterprises where, if there were clearer law, or areas where enterprises are working, where if there were a clearer law and sustained regulation over a length of time that they could feel confidence in, they would be in a better position. So you might imagine how an industry confederation or group of industries might come together to commission one of these things in order to try and get a more stable legal, social, economic platform from which to work. So an individual enterprise, I agree with you, but I do wonder whether industry confederations might be one place to kind of do this instead. Would be one thing. The notion of stakeholders, I mean, I think that's interesting, because of course we're all stakeholders in the sorts of decisions we're taking. The public are stakeholders in decisions that are taken around genome editing, but that's not what we mean by stakeholders in this process. When we talk about stakeholders, I think we're talking about people who have identified that they have a direct interest, they've identified they have a knowledge, and they've identified they've got opposition. So although the public are also stakeholders, because they will be impacted by the decision, they don't really know about it. They don't really know what their position is, or if they do, it's probably not very informed. And so they're a very, very different type of stakeholder. And that's why I think we talk about stakeholders and the public in different ways, and why I would talk about a stakeholder process as a very different sort of process than a public engagement process. This question around the kind of minimum scale and the difference between kind of co-design and what we're talking about, it's really, really difficult to talk about this in the abstract. So in some ways, the kind of minimum scale, I think, is really, really difficult, because it's very difficult for a local council or a regional government or even a national government to make decisions about genome editing. Because decisions are going to be made by multinationals across the globe, they're going to be made by the WHO, they're going to be made by the European Union. And so the question is, what is it that you can do? So it might be, if you're at a local level, you might be deciding, well, should we allow farmers to plant genetically modified crops in our area? And if so, why? If so, why not? And maybe can we use that process to inform the national and the global debate? But it comes down to, what power have you got? And what are you trying to influence? You can't influence the trajectory of the technology directly. You might be able to by your communication, but what you can influence potentially is the planting of crops. So just that question of what's open and what's not is really important. And I think, the sorts of conversations been having in Lombardy around the sorts of work that you're trying to commission, I think has highlighted for me quite how difficult it is, because Lombardy is a large enough region, it's got a significant budget, but many of the decisions that might be involved around net zero, for example, are being taken by Europe, let alone by the Italian government. And so what's the focus of the decision that Lombardy can take that the public can meaningfully impact in, I think is really, really difficult. But that said, we're working with Camden Council, a borough of about 70,000 people, around data. And we've delivered a citizens jury that has developed a charter for how Camden should use its data. And in January next year, we're going to be bringing together another citizens jury that's going to look back over the past year around how Camden has used the data. It's going to look at the charter and say, you should have used data in that way, you shouldn't have used data in that way. So you can have these at quite a narrow level. These are going to be very technical decisions about how data could be used, but they're going to be deliberative processes, because Camden is wanting to have this ongoing conversation with the public about how it uses data, because it wants to get it right, and it wants to have an open conversation to build trust in the way it's using data. So you can do these things in a very narrow way if it's about a decision that you've got impact on, and Camden can make decisions about what data it uses for what purposes and what not. So that's a very, very narrow. So I just don't think it's possible to answer that question in the abstract, because it comes down to what's your power.
So just to make sure that I understood. So in order to understand whether it makes sense or not, the first thing that the authority should do is some kind of materiality assessment. What I want to discuss is something that can have an impact on. Otherwise, if I can't, I should maybe use that money for something that is more meaningful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, definitely. Okay, I think we've gone over time. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Simon. I hope that all the examples, but the last example of Camden and how to have these iterative processes could inspire our region, in particular Lombardy region. So just by chance to say this. And yeah, thank you very much for your presentation, for your time. Was really, really nice to listen and to learn from you and from your long experience in this. Thanks a lot. Thanks to all the participants today.